Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we're going to continue our ongoing explorations of the cultures of consciousness. And one of the ideas of coupling culture and consciousness is that we explore ourselves, our perceptions, our minds, our experience of the world through cultural experience, through books, literature, poetry, film, music, subculture, fashion, drugs, media, TV, etc., etc. And that these two things are coupled in a very rich and exciting way that we sometimes divide. Like we think there's just this mysterious world of consciousness that either spiritual people or scientists talk about, this thing that's always with us, that we are, that we're inside, and then there's this whole world outside of us where of course, there are these profound loops between the two. And one of the reasons to pay attention to this loop, in my perspective, is that it opens up the realm of possibilities of our own experience and perception in the following sense, that, let's say, rather than approaching, movies or books as just sources of entertainment, as a way to distract ourselves, to fill up time, that they can become opportunities for different kinds of seeing and different kinds of experiencing, which means that the range of things that might work, that might feed into our explorations, increases dramatically in some ways. Difficult things become fascinating. Scary things, repulsive things, challenging things, all of those become possible avenues towards unfolding or experiencing aspects of the self, of consciousness, in a new, fresh way. And this spills over not just to cultural objects, but to life experiences itself. Sometimes things that might be incredibly tedious can become opportunities for insight and experience, precisely with this expanded frame of the relationship of mind and culture. Today we're going to be talking about one particularly awesome example, I would hope, of this process, Tarkovsky's 1978, I believe, film Stalker, and we'll be talking about it with Geoff Dyer, who's a wonderful writer, author of novels, none of which I have to admit I have not read any of the novels, but I've read a good deal of his extremely creative nonfiction. He has a wonderful critical voice weaving in his own experiences, an incredibly wide range of influences and fascinations, from photography to travel to Burning Man to jazz, and really a remarkable voice that resonates in a lot of ways with a lot of topics that we bring up on this show in a way that a lot of critical voices don't quite. He's got an unusually expanded mind, let's put it that way. So I look forward to talking about this wonderful film that anyone interested in the show would no doubt get a lot out of with Geoff. But first we'll bring on the co-host here, Maja Daou. Maja, how's it going? Are you there? Maja seems to have disappeared. So we'll go on with talking to Geoff, and I have a feeling that she will be joining us in a second. So
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. We lost you there for a second. How's it going?
I just heard him put me through.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, we had mentioned, I suggested you watch this film, but you said instead of watching this long, slow movie, which is very difficult to watch on a television or a computer, I would say almost impossible, although I did do it recently because I had no choice and I wanted to see it again. But you didn't get to do that. Instead, you got to enjoy the experience of your children having scarlet fever.
It was kind of like watching a horror movie.
What was that? I mean, I don't really know what scarlet fever. I mean, it sounds like kind of poetic and horrible at the same time.
I know, it's like the scarlet ibis or something like that.
It sounds terrible. It's like, I mean, is it common? Is it devastating?
It's very common. It wasn't too devastating. Basically, they just get a really high fever, and then they break out in a rash. So that's where the scarlet comes in. Their skin turns all red and bumpy. It's very not so good looking, but not too terrible.
Right, and so they survived all right. It's all good.
Yes, they're going to recover just fine, thanks.
Well, since you weren't able to see the film, but just given my initial riff and the things we've talked about on this show before, on what would be a recent example for you of an artwork, a film, a book, a musical experience that really, because of its form, because of even of its difficulty, challenged and pulled you into a new space of perception or a new way of experiencing time and memory and, the big stuff?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, that happened to me recently when I saw Antichrist by Lars von Trier, man. I mean,
Antichrist comes up in Geoff Dyer's book, so.
Yeah, I have not been messed up by a movie like that in a long time, but Lars von Trier did it to me, man. That really got into my psyche in a big way.
Just through the images, through the extremity of it.
And it was the psychological nature of it, that the possibility of someone that you love and are so close to and in your family can take on all of those different dimensions and become so destructive, and the places that the human mind can go kind of beyond our everyday levels on those, kind of deep, dark places is what really got into me.
Fascinating. Well, I haven't seen it. It didn't smell good to me, but maybe I'll have to. But with that, let's bring on Geoff Dyer. Geoff, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Yeah, great. Hi, Erik. And as just to pick up on what we were talking about, it was a source of outrage to me at first that von Trier had dedicated Antichrist to Tarkovsky. That was an outrage I experienced before I went to see the film, and within 10 or 15 minutes of being in the film, you can see why it's dedicated to Tarkovsky. It's shot through with all sorts of references and allusions. Ultimately, I think I actually think it's a rather silly film, but there's no doubt about the cinematic debt that he acknowledges to Tarkovsky.
Well, yeah, so I thought that was pretty interesting that Madra brought that up, and not knowing that it becomes part of your discussion of Stalker in the book Zona, which I guess is just coming out in paperback, so that's why we're having this conversation now. And I haven't spoken to you for many years, and there's a lot of things to talk about, both with this book and with your writing career in general, but I think I'll just start off a little bit maybe by setting the context, not quite yet of the film itself for people who haven't seen it, but a little bit more about a certain culture of art cinema that for people of certain generations is really quite formative. There was a part in your book where you talked about when you first started seeing these kind of, longer, often slower, often more difficult, often sort of intellectual in some ways, kinds of cinema, not Hollywood cinema, mostly European, although it fed into and created different kinds of moments in the history of American filmmaking as well. And you're probably about a decade older than me, but I had a very similar experience of when I was in college. We were blessed at the time to have, a dozen film societies, and so every weekend I would see at least 2 or 3 or 4 films, and it was just immersing myself in this world. And I didn't like everything. A lot of it I thought was sort of kind of confused by, but it fascinated me, and I kept going back for more and more. And I realized, and I think that you definitely talk about this, and you share a certain sense that films like Stalker and any number of other things that we could talk about, films by Bresson or Godard or whatever, they, especially when you're younger, can have this really formative impact. And not just in the sense of being insightful, philosophically interesting, a shape, a way to understand human relationships or art itself, but almost like a structuring of mind, of how time unfolds, of how memory interacts with perception. And I often find myself, even many years later, recalling or sort of almost being inside of certain films that were really influential to me at a certain time. And I hate to go fuddy-duddy on this show. Whenever I do, people give me grief. But I feel a real profound loss that shortly after, when I was in college in the late 80s. Within a decade, like, all those film societies were completely gone, and there was just DVDs, and people would maybe get together and party, and there was very little of that culture left. And of course, the loss of cinemas and independent cinemas, and that's the same story in the Bay Area as it is everywhere. There's a couple holding on or whatever. And so, before we just talk about Stalker, I'd love to hear you a little bit about just the sort of larger world of art cinema and how it kind of shapes one's sensibility, shapes one's experience or appreciation of the world and the self in a deep way.
Yeah, yeah. I think you've you've mapped out the territory very, very well there in the introduction to that question, Erik. And like you, I find it. I mean, I'm really not a nostalgic person at all. I'd like to say I don't have a nostalgic bone in my body, but I do feel a rather sort of elegiac sense of that loss of the art house cinema. And I remember so well when I was a student at Oxford, and every night there would be a late screening of some film. So like you, I was getting through this incredible number of films every week. And what it meant was that in tandem with the course I was doing, which was a course of English literature, so we were, plowing through the canon like that, I was kind of informally doing some sort of, totally unsupervised and random parallel course in film history. And that had certain. It was a particular moment, as you rather cruelly reminded everyone. I'm a decade older than you, and certainly back then there was this idea that was quite prevalent, actually, and it's something we can talk about. That often things that would be really great had about them not just a quality of difficulty. And we used to say that back in the prog rock era. Some albums were, they were growers, we would say.
Right.
They didn't yield themselves to us on a first listen. You had to listen to Closer to the Edge by Yes many times, an experience now which seems sort of similarly ill-advised. But yeah, not only were they difficult, but they often we felt that something that had the quality of boredom, that was often seen as, if something was a bit boring, that was a kind of quite often seen to be quite a close analogue of greatness. Now, that's not always the case, and for me, I think I started coming out of the other side of this thing with the film Ulysses Gaze, which seemed to me boring but not great. But I think, in a way, one of the reasons I ended up doing this book about Tarkovsky rather than anybody else, well, I think maybe the same thing could be said of Antonioni. It's this idea of the length of the shot is very important. So these art house films, they were they were slow moving, but it wasn't just slow moving in the sense of there wasn't much of a plot in the way that there would be for thrillers or film noirs or something. But actually the camera would be moving quite slowly. And Tarkovsky, he'd repeat something he would say something which is a version of what John Cage had said. He'd say, if you increase the length of a shot, the first reaction is one of sort of discomfort and boredom. Then you increase it still further, and it becomes, people become rather curious. And then you increase it still further, and you enter a completely different state, some sort of tranced out state. And I think that was the thing that I remember of these films, which didn't have any of the normal sort of narrative-driven plot excitements, but which, if you gave themselves to you, would take you into this other. They would not just be depicting another world. They really would be, as you said, reconfiguring, they would be, formatting one's brain, configuring one's consciousness of what a film could do.
Yeah, it's funny. When I remember when I first saw Stalker, which is long and has many long takes and passages that move quite slow or are simply looking at objects, beneath a river that runs along, and these sort of odd collection of things that may or may not be symbolic and probably aren't, and you're just sort of looking at these things. And I remember in my 20s being quite taken by it, strongly convinced that this was profound in some way and that it was opening up something that was worth the effort. But it was very effortful, and I don't know why exactly. Maybe it's because I don't actually watch a lot of I don't consume a lot of contemporary media, partly because the speed of the cuts I just don't enjoy very much, with some exceptions and things. But that now I realize that my sensibility is still kind of informed by that, in the sense that when seeing those films again, seeing Tarkovsky again, seeing other, more recent filmmakers like Regardis with Silent Light, which I thought was a very interesting kind of take on this tradition of the slow film, or slow art film that was more recent, is that it's very comforting now. And I watch Stalker or Solaris and go, God, I remember being kind of fascinatingly bored by this when I was young, and I'm not even bored by it anymore. It's it's kind of a refreshing, it's I can slow down and really just be in this space. And I don't know whether it's because I've done a lot of meditation or whatever, but it's very interesting to me. I'm very pleased, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the show and to just talk about whatever. It was just that how much I appreciate and am happy that I encountered this film in particular, but a number of films in that light, in terms of allowing a space within cultural experience that models ways of being in the world that I as I get older, I appreciate even more, even as they become more difficult to access in many ways. But why was it? Why do you think it's this film as opposed to a number of others that have undoubtedly influenced you and that you've loved over time and that you mentioned in the book? What was it specifically about this film that got you?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's certainly the case that I wanted. It's not the case that I thought I'm going to write a book about a film. Which one shall I choose? I wanted to write a book just about this film, and when I first went to see it, I was slightly bored by it. It wasn't a love at first sight kind of thing. And I think the reason I was bored by it, this is just to slightly harp on with the previous question a bit as well, is I think that when we're bored, it's not so much that there is this thing that is guaranteed to induce boredom, because as we know, it's a famously subjective reaction. It's more to do with, I think, the friction between the pace at which a film is unfolding, or the pace at which anything is unfolding, and the pace at which we expect it to unfold. So although I'd seen plenty of sort of slow films before, I think because Stalker was billed as a sort of science fiction film on release, that made me think, that made me feel a bit more frustrated by it. So it was only when I'd seen it once, and I went back to see it for whatever reason, because it sort of stayed with me. I think because some of the particular sequences were really haunting. I went to see it again, and what that meant is that I went into the cinema for the second time in sync with its rhythm, and I could give myself to it totally. But why this film? I think for two reasons essentially. One, because I really do think it contains some of the most beautiful sequences of sort of filmed photography ever. I mean, just things that are visually so beautiful. And the other thing is that I really think it's a very profound exploration of some of the deepest things in our lives. And I guess I think I've seen it more than any other film, and there was a sort of something that J.M. Coetzee said that was right at the forefront of my mind when I began writing it. He said that there are passages in the brothers Karamazov that he's read innumerable times before. And he says, but, rather than becoming sort of numbed to their effect by familiarity, he says, he still finds himself just overcome with tears. And for me, the more times I saw Stalker, the more profound it seemed to become, and the more deeply moving I found it. And God, there's all sorts of reasons for that, but I just mentioned one here. I think the more that you see it, the more you identify with this, with the character of the stalker, who is the guide that takes people into this zone. And I think you share both his faith, his belief in this allegedly magical place, and you share his despair that there are people who apparently don't have any need for this place. And I think that works on several levels, because I think we're all familiar with this experience whereby, let's suppose you start dating somebody, then at some point you'll probably expose them to this work of art. It might be a piece of music, a painting, quite often it's a film. And, it's something that means so much to you, and it's some sort. Everybody's aware that it's a rather high stakes phase in your relationship, because this isn't just a film you're going to. It's going to be some kind of test, because you feel that you could never love somebody who didn't love this work of art, because it would indicate some sort of fatal shortcoming in their character. So in a way, I think there's Stalker, this man who believes absolutely in the zone, and then you, in a sense, become you become like him in that you believe. I believe absolutely in the greatness, the magical importance of this film. So when you take somebody to see it, you don't want them to have the rather cynical reaction of the character called Writer in the film.
Well, and that's something that we've talked about a little on other shows, is the ability for the artists, whether we were talking about it with writers earlier, how they can alter your consciousness to kind of make you go inside their brains. Mm-hmm. And for me, I find with the longer paced films, especially when something takes its time, it does have this kind of consciousness altering effect, because you do have more of an ability to get into the person's point of view, because it's not just all staccato and focused on events. It's actually, you're looking through their eyes and you're kind of seeing stuff. I know a kind of funny example would be the spaghetti westerns, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly, where it takes 5 minutes and everything's quiet and you're just looking at the eyes the guys, and that's all that's happening. But what's really happening is you're kind of getting transplaced into the reality of that minute. And I feel if you can successfully enter someone's consciousness like that the artist can do it successfully, you for a moment share a kind of a mystical experience with them. So I think what you're saying is so true. When someone you care or love about can't share that mystical experience that you just had, it almost becomes a little bit religious in some ways,
Yes, indeed. And, goodness, as we know, Tarkovsky is a straight down the line sort of Russian Orthodox Christian. And you can see the zone. I mean, actually, all of his films are shot through with this kind of Christian imagery. But I think one of the things that so it's very obviously about a film about faith, belief, this kind of stuff, and this gives rise to all these kind of questions. What is the zone? But I mean, one of the things that we can be sure the zone is, it's about the wonder of cinematic space. So it's a question of believing in what the cinema can do. Just to expand on that for a little while, one of the things about maybe I should just, because not everybody listening will have seen the film, I'm going to just say very quickly what the film is about, and don't worry, because I can summarize the plot of this film in 30 seconds. So in some sort of unnamed but Eastern European place, there is this allegedly magical place called the Zone, at the heart of which, and it's forbidden, you're not allowed to go in there, at the heart of which it's claimed is a place called the Room, where your deepest wishes will come true. And there are these people called stalkers or guides, and what they do for a living. There's these kind of outlaw figures. They take people into this zone, and in the film, Stalker takes two people. One is called Writer. He's a kind of washed-up writer who's obviously going to the zone to try to rekindle some inspiration, and the other is a rather cynical scientist. Anyway, so he takes them into the zone, and there's it's a lovely looking place, but one of the very interesting things about it becomes almost impossible to work out exactly how long they've been in the zone, and it's absolutely impossible to work out in terms of sort of yards or miles how big the zone is, because the scale of it and the time scale of it are completely constructed by the camera. It's really, really remarkable the way he does that. Sometimes you think it's this huge place. Other times, actually, you think, God, maybe it's only a kind of, you could walk across. It's only 100 yards across, and you could walk to the Room in 30 seconds, as one of the characters says.
Yeah, it's for some reason this brings to mind like a very opposite kind of example but in terms of how cinema constructs space. Is I rewatched The Shining recently, and then I got kind of obsessed with all the sort of quasi-conspiracy theories or deep readings that people with too much time on their hands have made of this film, some of which are quite fascinating and some of which are obsessive and ridiculous. And one of the latter, although still interesting, was that because in a sort of interestingly similar though extremely different way, Kubrick is obsessed with how the camera constructs space. His spaces are often very linear and very symmetrical. And of course there's a lot of that in The Shining, the kids on the tricycle going through the space and whatever. And because there's so much information about the hotel that you're given as the camera moves through it, you can actually map it out. And what this guy had done is he had mapped it out. He said, okay, this is the corridor, and it turns left, and then he had pointed to these subtle anomalies. Well, like, this room has to be here, but that means its window can't be facing east the way that it does in the film. And these anomalies were really, incredibly important to him. And it was very interesting because it's kind of like the opposite, and yet similar in the sense that there's a way in which that however much we want to assume that the camera is moving through a real space, that there's always this kind of excess or slippage which takes it out of a completely ordinary frame of space-time, and then in Stalker that becomes the zone. I mean, that's the zone. It's not the zone is someplace because there was an asteroid that fell, or it's there's some magical beast that's loose. The zone is the space that the camera inhabits, and that connection between the thing itself and this much more amorphous sort of symbolic zone is part of the power of the film, which you talk about, quite well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is exactly what's going on there. And then, another way in which I think it's so, it's not for nothing. This is a film. I think one of the really most remarkable things about Tarkovsky, especially given his, straight down the line, Christian belief system, is the amount of space he leaves for doubt. So this, they go into this place, the zone, and it really is magical. It's wonderful, and at the same time, it's completely ordinary. And you realize that its magical qualities come from being observed so well, to pick up on an earlier theme, so patiently, so longingly. I mean, a rather cheap pun being used there, but yeah, its magic and its ordinariness are absolutely the same thing. So we see it simultaneously both through the eyes of the believer, the stalker, and from the completely cynical, unconvinced character of the writer.
Well, this is great stuff. We're going to have to take a break here. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Majid Daou. We're talking with Geoff Dyer about his most recent book, Zona, about Tarkovsky's book, Stalker, and we'll be right back.
This is PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. This is Majid Daou, and we're here with Erik Davis speaking to Geoff Dyer, the novelist. He just wrote a book called Zona about a film called Stalker. And Geoff, I was wondering kind of what your opinion on this is, just because of that, cinematic pacing and the ability to kind of shift things with that space. I mean, how do you feel like Stalker would do if it was released now? Because I know, like, a lot of the things we're talking about have to do with cinema and art films and things like that, but just in the general culture, how everything is getting faster and everything is like shorter, and it's all just like clips. No one investigates things as much anymore. Everything is like quicker, faster, gotta go, gotta get it. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are some exceptions, but I mean, how do you feel like, what place did those kind of cinematic features that take their time in such a way like that, how would that find a place now, do you think?
God, I think this is so interesting. I'm going to do a bit of sort of fence sitting here, because I think on the one hand, with the way that time has sped up and all of our concentration spans have been so denuded, I know I'm finding it more difficult to read now than at any time in my life. I mean, so I think for somebody who was seeing Stalker now at the roughly the age when I was seeing it, early 20s, I think it's one of two ways. Either it could just seem unbelievably slow, like just sort of cosmically boring, that it's as cosmically boring as, say, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann or something like that. Or either that, or I think its sort of magical quality could be even further enhanced, because it's not like it's quite slow. It's so obviously unfolding in some sort of different temporal dimension. And I guess, I don't know which way it would go, but I sometimes think it's helpful to sort of leap sideways into a different medium, so that one of the it seems to me that in some ways what I've always wanted from music or films is pretty much the same thing. I like this idea of just sort of trancing out to things. And Indian classical music has always been since my sort of mid-20s, it's been a massive part of my life. And, the thing with that, typically a performance of a raga unfolds over the course of, let's say, an hour on a CD, and pretty much the same in performance. And I think crucially what happens there is, for the first 20 minutes often you get the alap, where you get the solo instrument with no percussion, and just the kind of the thing, the world of the raga is sort of explored, and it's explored, and then then you get that thing of sort of pulse and more rhythm injected, until at one point you're joined by by the percussion, which is typically perceived as being, now you've got the return of time. Okay, so that's an experience which it's kind of quite difficult to have, in that you have to listen to that. You can't just listen to bits and pieces of a raga. You can't just decide, the phone went there, I'll pause it, so I'll pick it up again where I stopped it at 37 minutes and so many seconds. It's got to be from beginning to end. So it's an unwieldy amount of time, and you can't listen to it while you're doing something else. You have to give yourself to it absolutely. Anyway, so I'm always sort of proselytizing, so I made a CD for somebody here who wasn't familiar with this kind of music at all. And he found it absolutely transfixing. But there's it wasn't entirely surprising in a way, because he was somebody who'd actually been through that whole thing of rave music. So he was, he was attuned to this idea of things, of these experiences of extended durations, shall we say, like that. So that was a very digressive answer to your question.
No, I feel like it was pretty pertinent, and especially there are some pockets, small pockets left in our culture, I think you're right, with the rave scene, where people have a context to have that kind of patience with their experiences. And for me, I know as a young, teenager, I got really into Russian literature. And, I mean, that Russian mind is so able to understand long, arduous things. No one understands long and arduous like a Russian, I think. Maybe it's not so much anymore since culture is shifting, but I even got that, even just reading, my first, Tolstoy or, Dostoevsky, I was like, oh, this is someone who can, go for a long ways, But that's not happening anymore, and I want more stuff like that to be able to come in and have that part of people's minds activated. So I think you're right. I think the way we can do that is maybe through rave culture, almost that's where we can get an in with the kids, so to speak.
I think that it's funny, that thing for me, because I would contrast those things of, I think the key word, there's a key sort of word in here, which is waiting. And I so remember, one of the reasons I sort of stopped going to concerts is because I remembered how much waiting there always seemed to be.
Yeah.
You'd be waiting for the support band to come on, waiting for the band to come on. But whereas what I loved about those kind of rave party type things, there was no waiting at all. They went on for a long time, sure, but I never felt like I was waiting for the good bit to come because you were just sort of in the moment. So there is this sort of strange thing, really, that when you're listening to those to an Indian raga, I'm not impatiently waiting for the for the percussion to come in. I'm just able to give myself to the moment. And that is, so it never feels to me when I'm watching Stalker now. It never feels like I'm waiting for something to happen. Partly because I know it's not that kind of experience, but also I guess because it's not like I'm waiting to see what's going to happen. Well, but yeah, I think that I think any kind of waiting is horrible. I remember, I should have smelled a rat right from the beginning. But that novel by Jin, Waiting, my God, I really did have to wait a long while for that to get going.
No, well, let's stay with this a little bit, because this is really, really interesting, the value of this kind of experience and how it's both about art or a certain kind of art and also about something that's larger or more basic even than art. Just one thing right off the bat is that I saw there's been a revival of Einstein at the beach recently, and I went to see it, and I had seen it in the early 90s. And this is, of course, this 5-hour opera by Robert Wilson and Philip Glass, and it is non-narrative, and there's long chunks of extremely repetitive music with slight variation. And again, when I saw it in the early 90s, I remember going, "Whoa, that's a tough ride. It's cool, it's cool, but man, that's a hard a hard thing to swallow for 5 hours." And for some reason, again, I'm not really sure why, it just flowed by like honey. Like it was, there was no problem. And one of the things that you mentioned about waiting is one of the brilliant parts that I had forgotten, or maybe they did it differently earlier, is that it was supposed to start at 6:30, and so you walk in at 6:15, and it's already started. So you walk in, and they're already two actresses are already on stage doing this odd kind of numerical, repetitious pronouncement, and the difference that was introduced from the get-go by it always already being the case, it was extraordinary. Which is the same. What's one of the things about electronic music, about festivals or raves, is that it's always already on. You show it, it's always already there. Yeah.
I think, weirdly, I think that's what I liked about it. It's about that scene. So it goes on all night long. But weirdly, this was rather sort of. It was rather, I sort of felt it was well adapted for a basically impatient person like me. The other sort of massively sort of aesthetic experience of greatly extended duration I've had actually is Christian Marclay's The Clock. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that.
No, I've only read about it, but describe it.
Yeah, so it's what Christian Marclay has done is that he's compiled this film. Which consists entirely of moments, sequences from films when people are relating to time, when they are looking at their clock, or we could be having a conversation now, and I could say to you, "I'll meet you in 20 minutes," and you'd say, "What time is it?" And you'd say, "It's 1:30 or whatever." And anyway, so what he's done, he's constructed out of this a 24-hour clock. So it unfolds in, it's a 24-hour film, which is synced absolutely to the time at the moment. So whenever somebody is on screen saying it's, 3:20, that is the actual time. Anyway, so we went to see it in London, my wife and I, when it started there, thinking we would stay for 10 minutes, get the joke, and leave. And sure enough, we got the joke. But we had no desire to leave, and as word of this got around, so more and more people came, and less people had any desire to leave. And strangely, this became just about the least boring experience anyone had ever had, partly because you could leave whenever you wanted. There was never any sense of being trapped there. And the other thing is that it really did make you realize, wow, cinema, a lot of it is about time, as in his different way, Tarkovsky acknowledged. And what we were getting was all these incredibly exciting bits where people are either late for work at the most banal level, or at a more dramatic level, racing to meet their girlfriend on at a train before it leaves, or at the most exciting level of all, having to get to the place before the bomb is due to blow up at exactly whatever time it might be. And it turned out to be, the greatest story ever told, the story of time. And, of course, the other thing I should stress about it is that there would be certain climactic moments. So there would always be, something would always be going on, to use the CNN phrase, at the top of the hour. So, of course, it would be, something, you were aware that it was, say, 4 o'clock. And certainly you were aware when it was midday. But midday only lasted a second or two, and then it would just move on. So once again, you were just lost in this sort of constantly changing continuum, in which actually everything ended up staying the same.
That's wonderful, wonderful. Listen, we're got 15 minutes left or less, and one thing I had to ask you about is that there's. You talk about it in the book, is that there's this oddly prophetic quality to Stalker and its depiction of the zone. The most obvious and discussed one being the weird kind of premonition it seems to have at points with Chernobyl. And I remember even when I watched a 60 Minutes when I was a kid, sometime maybe in the late 80s, or sometime in the 90s, maybe early 90s, and they were doing a spot on Chernobyl and the people who still worked around it and studied the radiation, and a few of these characters whose job it was to bring in scientists who knew the area. So it was totally Stalkerville, and even the way these guys talk. Now, of course, they're making the thing. They want it to be as over the top as possible, because it's just kind of goofy TV journalism. Nonetheless, some of the quotations that these guys had were just remarkably resonant, almost as if there was no way to talk about Chernobyl without, in some sense, being in the after image of Tarkovsky's film. So there's there's that which we can talk about, but the other one that's much less obvious and discussed, but you're the perfect guy to talk about, is the relationship between this zone and this other idea of a zone that was really important in the 1990s, in particular the temporary autonomous zone, and particularly Burning Man. And for all your one of the wonderful things about your work is that you're erudite, you're very interested in all sorts of art forms, you've done all sorts of kinds of writing, but you also make a really interesting place for Burning Man in your own experience, for psychedelics, for a kind of sort of the outlier sides of contemporary culture and consciousness, and have woven it in very interestingly with some other concerns that are more whatever New York Review of Books worthy or whatever you want to say. So I'm really curious to it might be a slightly facetious kind of connection, but I know that you've written about that as well. So I would love it if you could talk a little bit about how your love of the film maybe set you up a little bit for Black Rock City.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I guess I'd begin by saying that although I haven't been to Burning Man since, Lord, how time flies. Can it really be the case that I haven't been since 2005? Well, maybe. But that doesn't alter at all my absolute belief that that Burning Man is the greatest thing I think that I've been to in my life, maybe the greatest thing I've done. And I guess I'd also say that from the point of view of a sort of ongoing writing life, it was disastrous because I've always written about what meant most to me at any given time, and for the 5 years or so I was going to Burning Man, it was, certainly for 3 of those years, it was by far and away the most important thing in my life, and I just couldn't write about it. It was beyond words, and I was very aware of that great bit of Martin Amis advice, and he says, if something's indescribable, you know what that means? You don't describe it. It seems so completely beyond the verbal. Anyway, I did end up writing about it in that book, Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered to Do It, and I think it's perhaps significant that the way I began framing it in that chapter was actually by referring to and quoting from the Tarkovsky film, partly because I think when they first made that trip out to the Black Rock Desert, it was advertised as a zone trip, and that kind of famous anecdote where they draw a line in the sand and say on the other side of this line there's a world that's everywhere different. God, and it's funny. I even just like with the Tarkovsky film, I can't quote those lines without sort of tears springing into my eyes, actually. But because of the profundity of the experience I've had there. So yeah, the Stalker film provided a badly needed way of framing and beginning to articulate and make sense of the experience. And it made me realize, God, yeah, these places like this fabled zone that Tarkovsky talks about, a place where your deepest wish can come true, goodness me, it does exist. It's not there permanently. It's only there for 1 week a year. But yeah, it had that zone-like quality. And perhaps I could even to refer that back again to the Tarkovsky film. There was. This is something which younger listeners will find extraordinary. There was a time when these great cultural artifacts, these great films, when everything wasn't just available at the click of a button. If you wanted to see Stalker, you had to wait and pay great attention to the listings magazines of whichever city you were in, because otherwise you might miss the one night that Stalker or The Passenger or Zabriskie Point, whatever it might be, whenever it was being shown. So in a weird way, these sort of revival houses, there was a temporary there was a sort of temporary quality to that as well. They became these pilgrimage sites, and of course, Burning Man is a kind of Black Rock City is a pilgrimage site. The other thing I would say in relation to that is, you're absolutely right that there's a kind of sense in which it lies outside the sort of the canon of respectable of great experiences. But one of the things I felt I was so evangelical about, and I've become no less convinced about it. There was no need at all to sort of grovel and apologize or to the art establishment saying, the art at Burning Man is quite good, because actually, I'm absolutely convinced that some of those things at Burning Man, they are way greater than the kind of than a lot of the stuff that is served up at considerable expense at various sort of art places and museums all over the world. I mean, in fact, for the most part, it's not even as though the competition is that fierce, is it? I mean, really, you compare with something like the Temple of Tears at Burning Man with something by Tracy Emin. I mean, really, I'm insulting the guy. I mean, by even mentioning him in the same breath. What's his name again? Is it David Best?
David Best.
Yeah, a way more important artist than so many of these. They don't even deserve the name of artists, most of them, these hustlers that are working at the moment. You see, now I really am sounding like Stalker.
Well, I feel like that brings up a pretty interesting point just with the idea of these autonomous zones and the effect that they have on us. I mean, like you said, back in the day when it wasn't as accessible, where there was a time and place where that would happen, when there's Burning Man and that's where it is and that's where it goes, all those things kind of have a way of trickling into us at such a deep level that we bring it into our other regular times. Like people that are burners or whatever, as a result of their experience in that autonomous zone, it starts to affect other places of their life, and they bring kind of Burning Man starts to, seep into their lifestyle or their identity or who they are. And when people have these profound experiences, like even if it's a film, someone having like that experience with Stalker, as you mentioned, can cause them to write a whole book about it. So something about having those autonomous zones, it's not only just sacred in that moment at that time, but it enables us to open that time in ourselves whenever we kind of want to.
Yes, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. Although I feel I should sort of just deflate myself here a bit. My wife loves telling the story about how we'd been at Burning Man one year, and it had been a huge experience for us, and it was great. It was absolutely transformative. And I think we'd left the site, and I was driving. I think I'd been driving for about 15 minutes before I lost my temper.
No, actually, I know that the leaving from Burning Man is a rough ride. I mean, that's part of it as well. It reminded me. In fact, I'm just thinking about it now. At this moment, is that one of the themes that you talk about in the book and that Tarkovsky's film is about is that this room provides it gives you whatever you want, not the thing you think you want, but the thing you actually want, and that there's something actually terrifying about that. And then the more you think about that or approach that possibility, the more complicated and revelatory the whole thing gets. And you do a wonderful job of unpacking that, which can be kind of elusive when you see the film, particularly the first time, and it's very important. I mean, it gets down to really some core issues about human being, and in a weird way, from certain angles, I think that Black Rock City functions that way, as well, in the sense that on the surface, it's like it's the great hedonistic free for all. You're going to get what you want. But what that is and what the consequences of that are is completely unknown, and most people find that there's there's a grueling aspect to it before, during, after that really reveals something about what it means to truly desire or to affirm enjoyment in its most radical and transformative sense. And that's actually, for me, some of the more profound aspects of it. But I actually think there is a connection between that, seemingly superficial party aspect of it and something that is much more like The Room. I agree, absolutely. And in fact, I would always come back from Burning Man. I mean, because this is so much my nature, full of regret for all the things I didn't do while I was there. I can hear that. Well, we just have a couple of more minutes here, and I'm just kind of curious a little bit about just how you would characterize, how this book, the themes that it brings up weaves into what you feel is the kind of ongoing question that you're pursuing in your writing on a larger level. How it fits in.
Yeah. Well, I guess in a way, I mean, it was partly because I take a certain amount of pride in the sort of range of my books, and so I was conscious that although I'd written about about jazz and photography and God knows what else, I hadn't written about film. So I wanted to, it was a way of sort of articulating what this film meant to me and my thoughts on film generally. But it's one of the ways in which the book embodies the subject of the film. That for a little while, when I was totally into the writing of it, all I wanted to do was to be at home writing that book. That was my deepest desire. And we all have this idea, it's summed up in the Bob Dylan title. When I paint my masterpiece, there is just this one thing we want. And at that stage, that was what I wanted to do, to be writing that book. But the way in which this, the fable of the film is both appealing and misleading, I think there isn't this sort of, once and for all, one-time thing. So I think really that, that book turns out just to have been just a sort of another increment in this, in this sort of ongoing series of books about things that have interested me. And yeah, I don't sort of wake up in the morning and think, now what does my life's work involve today? It's always sort of things are just always done incrementally, I think.
Great. Well, we'll have to end it there. Geoff, thanks so much for being on the show and talking about Tarkovsky with us.
Oh, thank you both. What a great pleasure that was. Okay, thanks again.
Wonderful. All right, from me and Majid, all you out there, keep your minds open.